Okay, we now know that we can have FIR filters that operate on scaled previous input values to give us zeros, and IIR filters that operate on scaled previous output values to give us poles. Well, we can also combine those to give us poles and zeros, giving us lots of control over the impulse response and the spectrum. Such filters are called pole zero filters. There's lots and lots of math we'd have to learn to really talk about and figure out how to design pole zero filters. But one super useful building block that we can learn quickly and use right away is called the biquad filter. The name comes from two quadratics for math reasons that we won't get into right now. But the biquad filter has two zeros and two poles and looks like this. This form of the biquad filter equation expresses the coefficients in terms of the frequency of the pole or zero and the amount of resonance or anti-resonance at that frequency. This form lets us control the zero and pole frequencies directly and the amount of pole resonance, which is exponential decay, or anti-resonance of the zeros via the R parameters. Rp, the pole resonance, must be strictly less than 1 to keep things from blowing up. The 2R cosine terms in the A1 and B1 coefficients keep things less than 2, and everything works out fine. To demonstrate, let's play with a biquad driven by noise. We're going to use a special configuration of the biquad filter called a resonator, or a reson Z in Chuck. Reson Z sets its zeros automatically to help regulate the effect of moving the poles around. So reson Z is controlled by only three numbers: frequency, which is the center frequency of the resonance, gain of the filter, and Q, which stands for quality. Filter quality is the amount of resonance in the filter. Q is defined mathematically as the center frequency of the peak divided by the width of the peak, and ranges from 0 for no resonance to very high numbers like 100 or 1000 or even more. Let's see how reson Z works. This program displays the impulse response in the upper left side and a diagram of the poles and zeros on the complex plane. That's part of the math of digital signal processing, and we won't worry about that right now, but it's interesting to watch them move around. I'm going to put some noise through this, and we can hear that there's a tuned aspect to this filter. I can move the frequency that corresponds to the center frequency of the resonance, or the pole position, and we hear the result. I can also change how much resonance there is. There's none. We're basically hearing white noise, but it's not really white because I can still move these poles around. If I move them all the way out, then it doesn't matter where I put the center frequency. And I can run the resonance all the way up to where the filter becomes an oscillator at that frequency. Wow, we've learned a lot about digital filters, but let's finish this session by getting to work making some physically informed sound. The most exciting thing for us and our interest in physical models is that we can use the resonator-oscillator nature of the biquad reson Z filter to model the resonant modes of physical systems. Pretty much any sound that's made by whacking or plucking something is a possible candidate for modal synthesis, but especially if it exhibits a few pronounced sine peaks in the spectrum, modal synthesis is more likely to do well at modeling it. Remember last session we looked at the sine wave modes of this wine glass and modeled them with one enveloped sine wave per mode? For example, this object will likely yield well to modal synthesis, but it might take a lot of sine waves to actually capture the behavior. On the other hand, this object won't work well for modal synthesis. This one? Very good for modal. How about this bench? Definitely. Would this work? Probably not. How about this? Definitely. Probably not. How about this? Oh yeah. Or this? Nope. Let's try this. So totally modal. What might we find on this that would yield to modal synthesis? Definitely. How about this? So there are many things that do not work well for modal synthesis. And there are many types of sounds that do work well for modal synthesis. So let's take this as an example and build a model of it using our resonator filters. So the first step in building a modal model of a sound, after you've identified that it's appropriate for modal modeling, is to record it and edit up the waveform so that your sound file contains only the strike at the beginning and the exponential decay. Trim everything else off so that it sounds like this. All right. Next, inspect the spectrum to see what peaks are there that look like modes. And so if we zoom in on this, we can see very clearly there are modes at these frequencies, which this editor is automatically locating for us. It just so happens that I've created some code in Chuck that makes this automatic and much easier for you. It looks at a sound file and determines what are the primary modes in there and gives you a list of them. Then you're free to choose from those and code those into a modal model. So let's look at that code right now. Actually, we're not going to look at this code because it's really long and involved, uses lots of DSP. It uses the Fourier transform to find and determine the peaks and measure lots and lots of things about what's going on in the spectrum of this sound. The main thing you need to know is that you need to put your sound file name in here, the one you're trying to analyze, and also give it an estimate of sort of how many peaks you might want to find, but also give it twice that many, because it's going to come back with a list of peaks, and then you can select from those based on your experience or what sounds better by ear. So let's just run that code and let it do its thing. It grinds over the waveform for a while, looking at the spectrum, piece by piece, and then finally at the end comes back with a list of all of the frequencies that it thinks are probably modes in this sound, including their amplitudes as well. This list is all ready to be copied and pasted into the resynthesis Chuck code, which I'm going to show you right now. So let's look at the resynthesis code now. I've copied the array over that was spit out by our FFT analysis program when it analyzed our plate plinking sound. I've edited this list to just include the most important modes. To my ear, from experience, you can experiment, which you'll be doing in the assignment. But I've come up with 10 modes that I think are important. I excite these modes with noise passed through a rapid envelope. The envelope's set to rise in 1 millisecond, decay over 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, and then go to 0. And so it's just gating a little burst of noise through all of these modes. I put all the modes into the DAC, hook up the excitation to all of them, set the frequencies from the table, set the amplitudes from the table. And in this case, I'm just setting the Q of each of the resonant filters to be sort of in order, the longest decay times for the lowest frequencies and the shortest decay times for the highest frequencies. So let's hear what that sounds like now. Interesting, pretty close to our plate. Note that how hard we hit it and where we strike it has a lot to do with which modes we excite. If we hit it right in the center, then we might excite some modes. Striking it on the edge excites different modes, higher frequency modes, lower modes, just depending on how we hit it. Experiment striking in different places and you'll see how varied the sound can be for a modal object like this. We can model and copy that explicitly by looking at the spectrum of each strike and mimicking the gains on each mode. Or we can just randomize the mode sum for each strike like what happens in real life because we can't strike exactly the same way every time. Let's modify our code and add a little section at the end that randomizes the amplitudes of the modes and just keeps restriking our virtual plate over and over. This piece of code at the end drops into an infinite loop that strikes the plate at random intervals in time and also randomizes the amplitudes of the modes from half to twice their tabulated results that are in our original table from the analysis of the plate. Let's run it. So first we'll hear the regular strike, and then we'll drop into the loop with all of the random strikes. We could, of course, vary that even more to give us more variety. But the interesting thing is it keeps its plate identity, but it's lively with each strike. If we were to try to do that with recorded sounds, we'd need a recording for each different strike, and we'd need a whole lot of them. Here we just need one model and a little bit of randomness.